Welcome back. I'm switching props on you for a couple of reasons. One, the prop that I was working on to show you the leveling and prepping the sides techniques is a cutaway. And a lot of you aren't going to start your first build with a cutaway. So we're going to leave that for the end of this little segment here on binding, and I'll show you some of the considerations you need to use when doing a cutaway, at least when binding it. But we're going to switch over to a standard double O type of Martin style body here with a very standard purfling scheme. We're going to use wood binding with a little laminate on the edge of it for both the top and the back. And on the top, we're just going to have a very simple purfling, which is a black, white, black purfling strip that's about 0.060 or something like that. Now, I want to make a couple comments about binding in general. Number one, always do the top first. In other words, bind the top first. The top is your most fragile part, and while you're binding, you're moving the guitar around and placing it down, things like that, and it's easy to crush a corner on this soft spruce. So always do the top first. The second thing is the type of glue that you use. I'm going to be using Titebond on the top to show you how to use a standard like aliphatic resin glue. Titebond is one of those. There's other brands available, but Titebond, the original formula in kind of the red label, is the one that I'm going to use on the top. On the back, I'm going to show you an alternate way of binding using super glue. And it's a lot easier to do when you have kind of a complicated purfling and binding scheme to use super glue, because what you can do is you can get it all taped in place and then put the glue in afterwards. So it allows you to get a very tight, precise fit. You really can't use super glue on most spruce guitars, because if you get the super glue and it wicks into the end grain of the spruce, particularly Engelmann spruce, Sitka spruce, and Adirondack spruce, it can leave a very ugly green state. It's not as much of a problem with some of the European spruces, but nonetheless, on spruce tops, I like to use standard Titebond glue. So let's get started by binding. I'm going to show you the binding technique for binding the top first, then we'll go over and we'll do the back with a super glue for the second part of this. The first thing that you need to do before you bind is make sure you've got everything ready. I've got my glue ready, and I like to put the glue in a smaller 2-ounce kind of squeeze bottle like this with a little bit of smaller tip on it. It allows a little bit more precise application of the glue. I've got my glue dispenser with brown tape. Some people tear off a whole bunch of strips and get them ready. I just get a couple ready, and then I'll tear off the tape as I need it. You need to prepare your binding channels and your binding before you bind it. And by preparing the binding channel, all I mean is just taking some sort of a sanding block, or I use these little detail sander thingies, and just clear out the fuzzies of the wood grain. The most important thing you need to do is to prepare the purfling and binding. Your purfling will have a kind of a ragged edge on it from where it was cut. So I take some 120 grit sandpaper and just get rid of it. Just like that, just to get rid of that ragged edge. The wood binding, it's more important that you prepare it properly. Your binding channel on the guitar, in some cases, is not perfectly square. And what happens is that when you go to lay your binding in, it may want to kick out a little bit because it's not sitting down flush. And one of the keys to a really good binding job is getting a gap-free seam here where the binding meets the side. If you don't get a good joint there, you're going to be spending a lot of time during the finishing process filling that with super glue or finish or something else. And it's a real pain in the you-know-what to do that. So it's really important that you prepare this binding. The other thing that you need to do is that you need to know that the tape is going to come up around and you're going to pull it that way. And if you have a real sharp edge there on the binding, it's going to break the tape. So what we need to do is we need to relieve this top edge where the tape is going over. And I'm also going to relieve this inside edge here, which is the edge that sits in that channel. So I'm going to take 120 grit sandpaper and I'm going to start by just removing or easing that sharp edge right there. You don't have to sand it away. You just need to relieve the edge, or the sharp edge rather. And then the other thing that you need to do is then relieve this top edge, which the tape is going to go over. And once again, you're not sanding it away. You're just relieving it so that you don't have a sharp edge. So do this on both pieces of your purfling and binding, and then we can start binding. To begin the binding of the top, the first thing I'm going to do is take my binding and find out where it's happy. In other words, where it's going to sit comfortably and tight where I bent it. I'm going to temporarily put a piece of tape right there. I'm going to come around and I'm going to mark where I'm going to put my butt joint. And my butt joint for the binding is going to be right at the center seam of the top, and I've left that mark there. So what we need to do is we need to cut that piece of binding square, and then we need to do the same thing to this piece. Make sure if you have a laminate line or a purfling line on your binding that it's facing down towards the side. Don't get them mixed up. Not that I've ever done that, but I'm just forewarning you. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll cut this seam right here. There's a couple of different ways to cut that seam square. Obviously, you could just go over to a bandsaw and then cut it. And then what you can do is then take a piece or a sanding block and then sand it nice and square. What I like to use is just something that I've had for years, which is an X-Acto miter box. It's an aluminum miter box, and you can cut 90-degree angles and 45-degree angles on it. The other piece of equipment that I like to have is a big piece of what I call the chopping block, or it's just a piece of wood. I've got end grain here and lots of things, and that just gives me a place to cut my binding. So the first thing that we're going to do is cut this channel right here. Or cut this. Now, this cuts a pretty square cut, but I still like to finesse it or tweak it a little bit with a little piece of wood with some 120 grit sandpaper on it. And all I'll do is I'll lay it on top of here, and I've got a little groove here, and I'll just sweeten it up. Make sure it's nice and square. And that's looking pretty good. So here's my first piece cut. I'll take some tape. Wrong tape. This is the StewMac brown tape. And I'm just gonna temporarily hold that. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut the other piece. Once again, I'll find out where the binding is the happiest. Bring it around. And then mark that point. I'm going to cut the other one. And I'm going to save these two pieces. So we now have our second piece. And once again, this is just a simple butt joint. Now, I want to make a comment here. When you're doing wood binding, make this joint as clean as you can, because you can't touch up maple binding really easily and make it go away. If you've got a bad seam or glue line there, it's very difficult. So try to get this as perfect as you can at this point. Notice what I'm doing here is I'm holding the block on the top. I don't have sandpaper on this edge. And I'm just going to move the binding back and forth. And that should be square. Take your time in making this as perfect as you can. It's more important that these bottom lamination lines line up perfectly, because if they're off, your eye is going to be drawn towards that more than they're going to be drawn towards maybe just a kind of a sloppy seam here. So make sure at the very least you get those little lamination lines lined up perfectly. Once you've got your binding cut, you can remove it and always tear that tape off at a diagonal. Put that there. Don't save the tape. Once you use it once, it's no good. Now we get to cut the purfling. You can, if you want, do the same type of joint for the purfling. The purfling is the inside decorative strip that goes around. You can just do a butt joint there if you want. The problem with a butt joint on lamination where you have a black, white, black is that you will always see it. I don't care how good you cut it, whatever your touch-up skills are afterwards, you'll always see it. So what I do is a little bit of a different technique for the purfling line. I cut what's called a scarf joint. And all a scarf joint is that you're going to move the purfling off the center, and then we're going to cut where it meets the other piece at an angle. So to do that, I'll take my first piece and I'll just cut an approximate 45-degree angle, maybe a little bit more, something like maybe a 50 or 60. So that's the one purfling strip there. Now, you can bring it up here, you can bring it up here. I wouldn't bring it all the way up here. Just bring it maybe an inch or two off of the center seam there. Your other purfling piece is going to meet in there at the opposite angle. It's going to meet in like this. And when you do your purfling that way, it meets at least the black, the white, and the black part. Now, keep in mind, they're only 20 thousandths of an inch wide. If they're off just a little bit, you're gonna see it. What this does is this technique makes them meet exactly in the center, or it centers them. The problem with a butt joint is that your butts are never quite the same on two purfling strips. So they'll always be off a little bit. So your purfling will go like this. And what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that I've got enough room to come up around the top. The other thing about your purfling is you really don't need to bend it, or you don't need to pre-bend it. The only thing that you have to make sure that you do is just remove kind of that ragged edge. And I felt a little bit on there, so that's what I'm gonna do. So, I've got my two purfling strips cut. I've got my two binding strips cut. I'm ready to start the gluing of the binding on the top. The procedure for binding the top is I'll start with one side, and I'm gonna glue both of them at the same time. Some people will glue the purfling in separately from the binding. And the reason that they'll do that is maybe if they've got a Florentine cutaway or some other kind of complicated cutaway where they need to have very tight miters. This is not a cutaway guitar, so we can go ahead and glue both at the same time. But if you do glue the purfling in separately, all you need to get is a Teflon or ultra-high molecular weight plastic strip that's about the thickness of your binding, and just use it as like the piece of binding would to hold it in. Then you can remove it after the glue sets up and then glue up your binding. But as I said, we're not gonna do that. I'm not gonna talk very much during this sequence because it gets a little bit hairy and your hands get dirty and you're gonna be looking for tape and all that stuff. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do it, and you can watch while I do that. The first thing I'll do is apply some glue to the purfling channel. And I'll come up to about maybe just below the center of about here. And I'm coming in about an inch away from the seam. Now, one thing I forgot to get was some paper towel. So I'm gonna go ahead and get that. And the way that I do this is I'll pull my purfling up and clean as you go. So I'll wipe that glue off. I'll take a piece of tape and I'm gonna temporarily attach that there. Now I can remove this piece of tape and glue in the binding. To glue in the binding, I'm just gonna start at the center seam here. And I've cut a very small hole in the tip of this glue bottle so I really don't make a mess. Okay. This is the binding for this side. So I will put it on the center seam here. Make sure that I'm oriented correctly. Nope, something's wrong here. That's the wrong side. This is the right side. See? Catch yourself mistakes right away. Okay. So let's try that again. We're gonna go on the center line here. I'll probably need a little bit more glue. I'll just use my finger, get that glue in there, and I'm headed for the center line here. Now, I want to show you how I bind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a strip of tape up here. And that's just to hold it temporarily while I do the actual binding here, because then I'll have two hands to do the binding. I will take a piece of tape, and what you want to do is you want to push the binding down and then pull it in. Again, push it down. And it's really important that you push that binding down against that side of the body so that you get a gap free. Now what I will do, now I will alternate the tape. I will now come down. The first couple strips I put here and I pulled up and over. Now I'm gonna alternate and take a strip and push it down. This is my temporary strip. Okay. Take this out. This was holding the purfling in. And always take that tape off at a diagonal. Now what I'll do is I'll take my purfling up to about the waist. Clean. And then I'm going to temporarily hold that in right about there. Now I'm going to attach the binding. Got a little bit happy with the glue there, so I'm going to take my finger Notice how I'm cleaning up the glue as I go. I'm going to temporarily hold that right there. Now I'm going to push the binding in. So I will take one piece, I will pull it. I will take another piece and alternate it. This one I will go down. Make sure you push that binding down. You want to see, if you can, even a little glue squeeze out there. See that glue squeeze out? That's what you want to see. This is my temporary piece of tape. Take that off carefully. Down, push it down. Next piece will come up and over. Okay. Let's get rid of this temporary piece. Okay, so it's really just a matter of working it out and around, and then we'll trim off the top. And the top is kind of easy because you don't have a seam that you have to meet up here. You're just going to get the binding and purfling up, and the fingerboard extension covers any excess. So I'll just work this around, and you'll see me do exactly what I was just showing you. Now, this part here at the waist is one of the most critical areas because that's where you're gonna probably get a gap if you're not careful. And just to go back to what I told you earlier, that's why it's important to make sure that you cut that piece of binding by putting it in where it fits in the best at the waist. Down. I'm going to bring this purfling up and around, and I'm going to attach it temporarily right there. Clean the glue. I'm going to get some glue in that waist area. See how I'm cleaning the glue off? Okay, so we got to come back. And as I said, the waist is a very critical part. So make sure you get good glue squeeze out, over and out, and then down. Over and then down. Get it? Okay. So we're pretty good up here. And I forgot get my nippers out. So we're gonna cut it there. And there. So we're pretty good. All we need to do now is finish that last part. So I will come up here, put my last bit of glue here. Clean as you go. I'm going to put a piece of temporary tape there. And what that does, as I said before, is that frees up my hands so I can use two hands to put that tape in. Notice how I'm alternating. Now this is where it's usually you get a gap, or at least I do, is as you come up around this upper bout. So I'm gonna really muscle that in and pull it this way. Pull it this way. And then I'll come down like that. Finally, what I will do, I will take a block of wood and a little hammer, and I'll make sure that that binding is seated down well against the sides. I can't begin to tell you how important it is to get that binding down against that side, because if you don't, those gaps will come back to haunt you during the finishing process. So once you have one side done, it's just a matter of repeating it for the other side. Now, this purfling, I didn't want to do that. It's really important that this meet correctly. So I'm pushing it in. Now, what I'm looking at here is I want to make sure that bottom lamb line meets up. It's really important that that be correct. Now, if you want, what you can do is put a clamp on the waist area. Don't gorilla it in because you'll make little dents in that maple, and that may hold in or cinch in that problem area, particularly if you have a tight waist. Finally, what I'll do is, as I did on the other side, I'll take a block of wood and really make sure this is down. And that's all there is to binding the top. I'm going to do one last thing though. I'm going to check this seam right here because I want to make sure that my lamination line is even. Because if it's not, and it wasn't, I need to correct it. Okay, top is done. We'll let that cook for a little bit, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the technique that I'm going to use on the back.